Morning, everybody. This is the third day and the final day of opening submissions in this part of the inquiry. I'll ask Mr. Rajiv Menon, KC, to start. Mr. Menon. Sorry, Mr. Menon, can you hear me? Something appears to have gone wrong with the sound.
Mr. Menon, can you hear us? Sir, I believe it's his end that he's muted. I think we should rise momentarily whilst we try and contact him.
I can hear you.
Oh, then please continue.
Then, can you hear me?
I can, sir.
Then would you please start your opening submissions? We can hear you perfectly clearly.
Thank you.
Don't worry, these hitches occur. Don't worry about them.
My apologies for the confusion.
No.
Good morning. Freedom Press is the oldest anarchist publishing house in the English-speaking world. Its newspaper, Freedom, now online, was set up in London by Charlotte Wilson and Peter Kropotkin in 1886. This was just a few years after Special Branch was founded in 1883, in large part to combat anarchism. Anarchists are Special Branch's oldest enemy, and anarchists involved with Freedom Press and the Freedom newspaper, which we will collectively hereafter refer to as Freedom, have been one of Special Branch's principal targets for well over a century. During the First and Second World Wars, their premises were regularly raided by the police, and anarchists involved were arrested and imprisoned. Since 1969, Freedom has produced its newspaper and run its publishing house and bookshop from an anarchist-run and owned tumble-down four-story tenement building down Angel Alley in Whitechapel. Vero Recchioni, an anarchist of Italian descent, better known as Vernon Richards, created the Friends of Freedom Press, a limited company with legal responsibility for the building, while the day-to-day running was done by the Freedom Collective, anarchists who dedicate their free time and energy to maintaining an anarchist presence in the heart of London. Over the years, the building has not only been targeted by the police, it was also firebombed by fascists in March 1993 and again in February 2013. The Special Operations Squad, set up by Special Branch in 1968, which became the Special Demonstration Squad, the SDS, also had anarchists as one of their principal targets. When MI5 and Special Branch decided to infiltrate Freedom directly in 1980, they chose an officer, Detective Sergeant Roger Pierce, using the cover name of Roger Thorley, who of all SDS undercover officers was to rise to the highest position in the Metropolitan Police Service, from the Detective Chief Inspector in charge of the SDS to Commander of Special Branch, and beyond that to Director of Intelligence. We have been given just 30 minutes today to open on behalf of Freedom. This, I'm afraid, is not nearly enough time to do justice to Special Branch's war on anarchism or even SDS spying on Freedom. For that reason, we would encourage anybody watching this oral opening who is interested in the bigger picture to read the longer written version of Freedom's opening, together with the witness statement of Steve Sorba, Secretary of Friends of Freedom Press, who will be giving evidence on Freedom's behalf next week on Monday, the 8th of July, and the witness statement of Patrizia Giambi, the Italian artist whose tale we will come to later. We are very grateful that Patrizia has agreed to share her fascinating yet shocking story with us, a story which illuminates the insidious role played by Special Branch in political prosecutions. Freedom's written opening, Steve's statement, and Patricia's statement will all be uploaded onto the inquiry's website in due course. It was in 1974 that Freedom first featured as a target in an SDS annual report. Since then, disclosure of SDS reporting about Freedom has been necessarily partial and fragmentary. This is an inevitable consequence of the obsessive institutional secrecy of both MI5 and Special Branch that continues to this day. The outcome of this institutional secrecy has led to some important evidence being given in closed session and to a mass of redactions in the documents. For instance, we are still forbidden to know the names of all the groups spied on and the cover names of all the undercover officers. In our view, the publication of at the very least of those names and cover names was the litmus test for whether the inquiry was going to be open and transparent. The only reason we are not being told all the names and cover names appears to be to protect the identities of undercover officers from decades ago. Another demand of the non-state core participants was for full disclosure of their own files. This too has been denied. Instead, the inquiry is only disclosing documents to a non-state core participant that they think are relevant and contain a reference to that particular non-state core participant. Additionally, these documents are of course redacted for state secrecy and privacy. It is a tortuous process that is both enormously time-consuming and costly. Obviously, there is plenty that the British state wants to remain hidden. However, on a more positive note, we do have an inquiry about an aspect of the secret state, undercover political policing, that we have never seen before in the UK. And for anarchists, being targets of this type of policing goes back a long way, right back to 1886, when Freedom was founded during the zenith of British imperialism, at a time when socialist and anarchist ideas were spreading widely amongst the working class. In short, the history of spying on anarchists in Britain is also the history of state intervention, provocation, fabrication, and an attack on the purported freedom of the press. The historian E.P. Thompson summed it up when he said that, quote, "It was the fond belief of the English people that the employment of spies in domestic affairs was un-British and belonged to the continental spy system. In fact, it was an ancient part of British statecraft as well as of police practice." End quote. Special Branch were the political police in Britain and became well versed in such tactics. We know that anarchists from Freedom have been spied on for nearly 140 years. Registry files were opened by Special Branch well before the SDS was even conceived. In respect of Freedom Press, its registry file was opened in 1964, presumably after the previous one was full up. We do not have the date of the first file, but it may well be 1887. It is still unclear when in fact the registry was set up, but it appears to have been operative in the 1920s. We can safely assume that prior to 1968, Special Branch used old-fashioned methods of gathering intelligence without the need for employed undercover officers. This would have meant scanning the anarchist press, talking to activists, meeting informers, operating surveillance on protesters, tapping phones, etc. There was no obvious need when SDS was set up in 1968 to plant undercover officers into Freedom. Special Branch already had ample intelligence. Detective Sergeant Roy Creamer of SDS had acquired unrivaled knowledge of anarchists and anarchism. He gave evidence during the Tranche 1 hearings that he felt the old-schooled method of the direct approach was adequate for the needs of Special Branch, and that in 1968 he expected SOS, as SDS was then called, to be wound up. He was alert to the dangers of the use of long-term agents in deep cover, namely the tendency towards either agent provocateur activity or what was later called Stockholm Syndrome. This is precisely why SDS's methodology was inherently dangerous and unreliable. The limits recommended by the creator of SDS, Detective Chief Inspector Conrad Dixon, were almost immediately abandoned by the Met hierarchy in favor of long-term penetration of radical groups for intelligence gathering purposes, much to the delight of MI5, who were given copies of SDS reports via Box 500 and could and did make targeting requests. anarchist groups were part of the initial targeting. HN 300, with the cover name of Jim Pickford, who, although deceased, has been given anonymity over his real name to protect the privacy of his family, had been deployed from late 1974 to December 1976. He spied on Freedom and other anarchist groups. HN 304, with the cover name of Graham Coates, reported on 6 anarchist groups between 1976 and 1979, including Freedom, who he described as wishful thinkers. He effectively took over in the anarchist field from Pickford. In the conclusion of his witness statement, Coates states as follows: "I did not witness any public disorder while infiltrating the anarchists. The anarchists I reported on posed a minimal challenge to public order. They did not do much in the way of public demonstrations. Their numbers were small, so even if everyone in Greater London who was prepared to call themselves a libertarian or an anarchist had joined a demonstration, I doubt there would have been more than around 100 people. The anarchists did not even really discuss activities that would be a public order threat. Their threat was only based on anarchist history. The anarchists would like to have thought themselves subversive. Their views were subversive to a conservative government, but they were not actively subversive. None of the anarchist groupings I reported on was significant in terms of numbers or even in terms of threat. The whole thing was riding on the tailcoats of the angry brigade in terms of what the Metropolitan Police Service, the government, and special branch feared they were able to do. The grouping that had most potential was the Anarchy Collective because of its link to the Angry Brigade, and even they did not become subversive in their actions or what they achieved. The inquiry has disclosed SDS annual reports through to 1996. Freedom features in all of them from 1978 to 1991, the period during which Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and during which she identified the enemy within as a clear political target of the state. In total, over 50 political groups under the anarchist heading were spied on by SDS during this period. From 1991-1992, after the end of the Thatcher government, and as MI5 stepped back from counter-subversion to deal with provisional IRA attacks on the British mainland, SDS annual reports no longer listed the groups penetrated. The reviews of anarchist activity were concentrated solely on the class war group before switching focus to community groups and campaigns against repressive laws. By the time of the Labour election victory in 1997, just after the end of the period under scrutiny in Tranche 2, SDS activity was focused away from strictly political anarchist groups and much more on animal rights, community groups, justice campaigns, and anti-fascism. The last SDS annual report we have for 1996-1997 highlighted the Security Service policy decision to reduce its counter-subversion role with no active investigations or operations at all in this field, and concluded this move effectively leaves it to the police to monitor political activism from a public order standpoint. The public order justification almost seems to have come as an afterthought. In any event, the Metropolitan Police Service were more than happy to continue to monitor political activism as they had since the inception of Special Branch. In fact, within a couple of years, Roger Pierce, by now commander of Special Branch, was together with other colleagues in the British security apparatus about to create a new national spying organization, the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, NPOIU, which would hugely expand political surveillance, with hundreds of environmental and social justice campaign groups spied on. In a sinister move, the NPOIU was placed directly under the control of the Association of Chief Police Officers, AGPO, which was reconstituted in 1997 as a private company, and hence was not under the political control of government. The secret state was being privatized. Meanwhile, Roger Pierce, after retiring from the Metropolitan Police Service, reinvented himself as a novelist, drawing on his experience as an SDS spy within the anarchist movement back in the early 1980s. He has written 3 novels to date, in which his protagonist and alter ego, Detective Chief Inspector John Kerr, takes down some pantomime villains who happen to be grossly caricatured anarchists. His description of anarchist lairs is similar to both the Freedom premises in Angel Alley and the homes that he visited of Dave McCabe and Patricia Giambi. The importance of this, we say, is that there was always an element of fantasy about Pierce, a desire to sex up his reports with lurid gossip and innuendo, character assassination, and a style of writing that would commend itself to his superiors in MI5 and Special Branch. SDS asked MI5 to provide Pierce with a briefing about freedom. Pierce recalls in his witness statement that there was an advice from MI5 that they would value the targeting of anarchist groups, and the SDS were also looking for greater coverage of the anarchist field. Pierce also recalls that he went on a course on counter-subversion run by MI5. Interestingly, there's nothing in his witness statement or in any extraneous evidence of Pierce receiving any training in relation to public order from A8 or any other department of Special Branch or the Metropolitan Police Service. Nevertheless, Pierce, knowing that this is the only defense available to the Met in its last-ditch attempt to justify the enormous scale of SDS spying, states that the laser focus of SDS was to gather intelligence about public disorder. Yet hardly any of Pierce's nearly 600 reports include any mention of public disorder. Rather, they reflect Pierce's take-a-look approach, with lists of names of people writing to Freedom asking for anarchist literature, copies of newspapers, leaflets, and other documents, intimate reports about collective members, and political speculation, all justified by Pierce given his overbroad definition of subversion. The fact that the SDS annual reports and the letters seeking further funding for SDS from the Home Office state that the primary purpose of SDS was obtaining public order intelligence flies in the face of the overwhelming evidence, namely the intelligence reports of the undercover officers themselves, which the Home Office never saw. The collateral reporting about public order, almost all of which has been supposedly destroyed, if it ever existed, was effective in giving plausible cover to the SDS's concealed primary purpose. The fact that Special Branch provided routine threat assessments for police public order planning does not detract from the argument. SDS reporting was never primarily about upholding the Queen's peace. It was about spying on the Queen's supposed domestic enemies. It would be quite wrong to take the SDS's self-proclaimed purpose at face value. In any event, the idea that SDS intelligence had any real impact on the major public order events of the day is fanciful. In Tranche 2, the inquiry will cover the period of the major riots and uprisings of the 1980s and early 1990s, none of which were predicted by SDS. Returning to Pierce, we have not been provided with a photo of him in his undercover persona of Thorley. However, Pierce has provided us with a description of sorts, saying he was called Trotsky, presumably by those at Freedom, due to his appearance, although he does not mention sporting any round spectacles. Despite this, few Freedom old-timers can recall Pierce, except for Dave McCabe. It is unfortunate that the inquiry is not interested in receiving a witness statement from Dave McCabe, despite Dave being prepared to provide one. Firstly, nobody in Freedom knew Pierce better than Dave. Secondly, Dave was himself a victim of police brutality at the hands of the notorious Special Patrol Group in July 1981, ending up in hospital and on crutches, before being convicted and imprisoned on fabricated evidence in yet another miscarriage of justice. Pierce would have known all about this as he continued to spy on Dave, yet it does not feature in his reports. Another interesting thing about Pierce is his very cozy interaction with the MI5 desk officer on the anarchist desk, a woman with whom he regularly went to a wine bar in Berkeley Square, as opposed to the pub in Curzon Street, where the MI5 male spooks used to hang out. It is unclear why he had so many meetings with her and how far these were sanctioned by his supervisors, either officially or unofficially. The MI5 SDS liaison file makes it clear that it was SDS policy for MI5 desk officers not to know the cover identities of SDS officers. So what was going on between Pierce and the female MI5 desk officer? In your Tranche 1 interim report, sir, you found that the evidence showed a much closer relationship between MI5 and the SDS from 1979, after the election of Margaret Thatcher and while David McNee, the Bible-thumping hard man from Glasgow, was MPS commissioner. One wonders if this was a result of the traditional introductory meeting between the new Prime Minister and the Director General of MI5, at that time Sir Howard Smith. In any event, from then on, regular discussions between the head of Section F6 counter-subversion and the DCI and DI in operational command of SDS took place, at which Security Service requests for intelligence were discussed. The relationship became even closer after the appointment of DCI Barry Moss in 1980 and DI Trevor Butler in 1981. Monthly meetings were held from February 1981 onwards. These managers were the immediate superiors of Roger Pierce. The MI5 loose minute dated the 3rd of March 1981 requested specific information on anarchist activities in London, particularly at the 121 bookshop on Railton Road in Brixton. Who was involved, the layout of the premises, what was stocked, whether there was a telephone, and whether it appeared to be a successful venture. A request was made for information on the direct action movement and the Anarchy Collective. It was Roger Pierce who was tasked with answering these requests, just 1 month before the Brixton riots of the 11th to the 13th of April 1981. While part of the Freedom Collective, Pierce wrote articles on 2 subjects, Northern Ireland and legal matters. His apparent expertise in the second subject, having a law degree from London University, enabled him to spy on meetings where legal advice was given and report back accurately about the legal strategies to be adopted by the likes of Patricia Giambi. While undercover, Pierce positioned himself politically on the pro-Irish Republican side of the fence. By contrast, most members of the Freedom Collective were firmly sitting on the fence in respect of this issue. This was a deliberate ploy by Pierce, and Pierce used it to draw closer politically to those who shared the same view of unconditional but critical support for Irish republicanism. His Prisoners of Politics article in Freedom argues for the Irish Republican prisoners who had started a hunger strike in 1980 being given political status. On the 9th of April 1981, one of those hunger strikers, Bobby Sands, was elected MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone. When he died on the 5th of May 1981, there was a huge outpouring of public sympathy, and the political mobilization that followed prompted the Freedom visit to the Belfast Anarchist Collective at the end of May 1981. Pierce took this opportunity to solidify his link to a more pro-Irish Republican position. On the 4th of July 1981, Pierce managed to get the front page of Freedom for his article, The Not-So-Distant Struggle. He would have known that this article would stir up a hostile reaction from many in the Freedom Collective, and he was able to exacerbate divisions. We posit that there always was an overarching brief, for undercover officers and intelligence agents to sow division if need be. What is clear is that while Pierce used his entry into Freedom to gain general access to anarchist groups, his direction of travel was away from Freedom in Whitechapel and down to Brixton and the anarchist groups associated with the 121 bookshop. He used his Freedom comrade Dave McCabe to facilitate his entry by driving them together to the bookshop at the weekend. Sadly, the 121 bookshop is not a non-state core participant in the inquiry, despite the extensive reporting on the collective there. Pierce's objective was clear. He increasingly used his political cover to get closer to anarchists who he thought were more involved in direct action than the Freedom Collective. This gave him the opportunity to spy on those arrested and charged and their lawyers. There is no separate category, unfortunately, for lawyers spied on by SDS in the UCPI, but from the intelligence reports disclosed so far, we know that Special Branch had registry files on many of the most well-known defense lawyers of the period, including those who represented anarchists. Defense lawyers are likely to have been targets of MI5 interest and subject to technical and human surveillance by both MI5 and Special Branch. Indeed, one particular solicitors' firm that represented many political activists had its own organizational registry file. It is unclear whether all the lawyers who worked for this firm were deemed worthy of having individual files opened on them, or whether this depended on the clients they represented or the meetings they attended. However, they do appear to have been spied on not as political activists, but as lawyers, despite the fact that they clearly did not represent either a public order threat or a threat to parliamentary democracy and the state. How could this possibly be justified? We hope the inquiry will investigate this important issue. Pierce had already claimed as part of his undercover identity to have knowledge of legal matters and wrote for Freedom on such topics. He was therefore in an ideal position when it came to arrests and defense campaigns arising out of the Brixton riots in 1981 to attend and record the content of legal advice. By putting this in detail in his reports, he knew that it would be disseminated from C Squad to the appropriate section of the Met. As we only have the box 500 copies from MI5, we do not know to whom else Pierce's reports was disseminated. The Metropolitan Police Service have conveniently destroyed almost their entire archive, no doubt to avoid institutional embarrassment and liability. In his witness statement, Pierce states that while he carefully recorded the detailed legal advice given by lawyers to defendants, this was not a breach of legal professional privilege, as the advice was given in a meeting that was not confidential to the client. This is entirely disingenuous, as the lawyers were obviously unaware that he was a police spy who was reporting back directly to the very organization that was prosecuting their clients. Pierce states that the main lawyer in question, as well as the defendants themselves, would have treated him as a trusted friend. Pierce, SDS, Special Branch, and MI5 had not the slightest concern about breaching legal professional privilege. It is almost certain that the lawyers' phones were tapped as well. The strategy was all about spying on the lawyers to give an unfair advantage to the prosecution by recording privileged legal communications between lawyers, their clients, and supporters. However, it does not end there. In the case of the Brixton riots in 1981, the Thatcher government and the MPS had a direct interest in covering up the truth about the reasons for the riots, not just the obvious trigger, namely MPS's Operation Swamp, but also the surrounding circumstances of economic deprivation, racial discrimination, and racist policing. Special Branch were therefore tasked to assist in providing a false narrative that would enable both the Thatcher government and the Met to get off the hook and falsely blame the events on anarchists, and in keeping with their overall institutional racism and xenophobia, foreign anarchists. Pierce's assessment was that the involvement of anarchists in Brixton was no more than a few joining in what had already started. In other words, anarchists were not the instigators. This was also the assessment reached in the SDS annual report of 1981. However, this was not the narrative provided to the media, who were extensively briefed by Special Branch, as is clear from the press reporting of the day. Pierce therefore would have known that the briefings were false, but that this was perfectly acceptable, as it was all part of a political struggle, and he was a political policeman loyal to the cause. His reporting on Jean Weir and Patrizia Giambi wrongly linked them to the Italian Marxist-Leninist armed group, the Red Brigades, Brigate Rosse. It was this link which was fed to the press in an undoubted attempt to convict both through sheer prejudice generated by Special Branch and deployed by the Metropolitan Police prosecutor in court. Jean Weir was fortunate to be acquitted at trial, as her lawyer was able to summons a BBC reporter who gave evidence that undermined the police evidence of identity. But poor Patrizia Giambi, a young school teacher on leave from her job in Italy, who had come to learn English in London, was made to pay the price, being sent to prison on fabricated evidence with political and xenophobic prejudice deployed against her in full. Pierce got close to both women and their lawyer by attending meetings about their cases and reporting on the legal advice they received to his superiors. He did nothing to alert his bosses that the supposed link to the Red Brigades was untrue. In fact, Special Branch appears to have opened a file on the Red Brigades around the same time. Did MI5 know better? Did they not brief Pierce in one of his regular wine bar meetings? Or was it the case that this was deliberate misinformation recorded against the women for political reasons? We believe that Pierce played an important part in Patrizia's wrongful conviction through his spying activity and reporting the legal advice given in detail back to Special Branch for deployment by the police prosecutor in court. He knew that Patrizia was innocent, as he knew Dave McCabe was innocent, but his political loyalty to the branch outweighed any sense of justice. One final clue we have about these Special Branch manipulated prosecutions is in A Case for Protest, Pierce's article in Freedom, in which he suggests that stipendiary magistrate Nichols was widely believed to have close links with Special Branch prosecutors. Dave McCabe's and Patricia Giambi's convictions were miscarriages of justice and should be quashed. In conclusion, sir, In your Tranche 1 interim report of June 2023, you refrained from expressing any view about the proposition that the SDS was one of the instruments set up by a conservative state to suppress the aspirations of those who wish to produce radical change by political means. We say that this is self-evidently the case. Any state will defend itself similarly, and the British state continues to do so, with or without agencies or instruments like the SDS. Anarchists believe that their ideas are genuinely subversive of the existing order. Having said that, freedom was effectively a propaganda factory for ideas, whose principal aim was to keep in print the anarchist classics, run a bookshop, and print a fortnightly newspaper. Freedom operated above all in the realm of ideas, ideas which the political police wanted to stop spreading. Special Branch was initially set up in large part to combat anarchism and has continued that fight over the last 140 years. Of course, freedom has been raided on numerous occasions, had editors and writers jailed, seen its fare of fabricated prosecutions, and been spied on throughout. That is what the British state does. But freedom was never a real threat to the British state or parliamentary democracy, nor were any of the anarchist groups who were spied on. It took until the early 1990s for the security service to step back from counter-subversion in order to concentrate on serious matters. However, this left the field wide open to Special Branch, who increased their surveillance and whose commanders, notably Pierce, helped set up the national spying organization, the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. And with the huge expansion of technological surveillance via GCHQ, we now have a vast spying apparatus in the UK that can spy at will, in live time, on almost every British citizen. This is a far, far worse situation for civil liberties and human rights than in 1968, when SDS was founded. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Menon. Thank you in particular for sticking to the time limit that you have reluctantly accepted. Very grateful to you. Thank you.
Yep.
We will hear next from Lily Lewis.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I make this opening statement on behalf of 3 core participants to your inquiry: Jane Hickman, Rebecca Johnson, and Hilary Moore. These 3 women stand in solidarity with each other on account of their shared experiences, which led to their involvement with this inquiry. Each was born in the early 1950s. Each, in their own way, was committed to the cause of peace and disarmament, and each campaigned publicly, peacefully, and openly against the deployment of nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom. And each has been subject to wholly unjustified, intrusive political monitoring and surveillance by undercover police, apparently instigated at the insistence of Margaret Thatcher, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Sir, in the summer of 1983, at the beginning of the time period under consideration by the inquiry, Hilary Moore was 31 years old. She was working with disadvantaged children and young people with special educational needs in a school in South London. She developed this role, moving to a further education college in Bristol in 1990 until her retirement some 11 years ago. After visiting Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in 1982, she co-founded the group that became Lambeth Women for Peace, which I will refer to as LWP. The group existed to support the women at Greenham Common and to educate and spread the message of the camp into the local community. The core principles of the group were non-violent and internationalist. At this time, Rebecca Johnson was 29 years old. She had graduated with a master's from SOAS and postponed her PhD to become involved in the Greenham Women's Peace Camp in 1982, when it was a small and active protest of 15 to 20 women committed to non-violent disarmament and peace. She stayed for 5 years at the camp. Since then, Dr. Johnson has spent her life engaged in diplomacy in different capacities on the international stage to seek to secure nuclear disarmament, contributing to the adoption and implementation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty from 1987 onwards, the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So successful has she been in this work that she shared in the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons in 2017. Jane Hickman was 32 years old. She was then a solicitor at Fisher Meredith in Stockwell and went on to become the highly successful founder and senior partner of the city law firm Hickman and Rose. She came to the Greenham cause through her role in representing clients arrested at the base, including Rebecca Johnson. Her role in LWP, Lambeth Women for Peace, was as an ordinary participant and supporter. Her energy as a young lawyer can be seen in her work representing Greenham Women Against Cruise Missiles, a group of activists who wanted to test the lawfulness of locating and deploying cruise missiles in a densely populated area. Ms. Hickman assisted them in seeking an injunction in the US federal court against President Reagan to prevent the export of cruise missiles to the UK. Sir, it is crucial to this part of its investigations that the inquiry understands who the Greenham women were and what they stood for. I will then turn to the Special Demonstration Squad, or the SDS, and its surveillance of the Greenham women, the lack of justification for this, and then finally, what we say were the real motivations for state intrusion into the women's peace movement. As counsel to the inquiry has already set out in his opening statement, the Greenham camp formed in the early 1980s against the background of the threat of nuclear war. People in Britain were more aware of the catastrophic impact that a nuclear attack would have. Political opposition to cruise missiles had grown. At the same time, as Hilary explains in her evidence, there was a desire amongst women in many areas of civil society to assert their political agency. In her words, there was a lot of positive agency that women could change the world and campaign for peace in a more creative and imaginative way. In 1981, a group of Welsh women formed Women for Life on Earth and walked with their children from Cardiff to the Greenham Common Air Base. Once there, some decided to stay and set up a peace camp in order to demonstrate their determined opposition to the government's decision to deploy US cruise missiles at the base. Missiles were due to arrive there in 1983. From its start, the peace camp's public profile grew rapidly and gained widespread support, drawing in women from a range of backgrounds. I'd be grateful if photograph 1 can now be shown. Thank you very much. In December 1982, the Embrace the Base protest attracted 35,000 women, enough to join hands around the whole 9-mile perimeter of the airbase. Then, in the 1983 New Year's Day dawn protest, 44 women, including Rebecca Johnson, occupied a nuclear silo that was under construction inside the base. I'd be grateful if photograph 2 could now be shown. Thank you. This photograph of the New Year's Day dawn protest was featured in newspapers around the world. There were no leaders or formal positions of responsibility within the peace camp. Any woman was welcome. To be a Greenham woman meant committing to using non-violent actions for disarmament, peace, and justice, and taking personal and political responsibility for one's actions. The Greenham women had numerous aims, but they held a generally agreed objective of changing government policy so that no cruise missiles or other intermediate range nuclear forces would be situated or deployed in the UK. They also aimed to highlight the catastrophe that nuclear weapons presented and that nuclear disarmament was both possible and sensible without the use of any violence. The Greenham women, along with associated groups such as LWP, believed in achieving change through democratic means and were firmly committed to non-violence. The Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp is now widely recognised as a movement of historic importance. For one, it marked a turning point in the political lives of the many women involved. As Jane Hickman explains in her witness statement, a large number of women were introduced to the experience of exercising political agency and demanding that their viewpoints as women be given proper political weight. I'd be grateful if that photograph can now be taken down. Importantly, the Greenham women were successful in many of their political aims. Although American missiles arrived at the base in 1983, in 1987, US President Reagan and Soviet President Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which paved the way for the removal of cruise missiles from Greenham. As a result, the last missiles left the base in 1991. As Hilary says in her statement, as with many political grassroots movements, it's in retrospect that we can see what catalysts for change they were. The suffragettes in gaining votes for women, the anti-apartheid movement in providing pressure for positive change in South Africa, and the women's peace movement for contributing to the de-escalation of nuclear weaponry. Sir, I turn now to what is known of the surveillance of women peace activists by the SDS, and HN33's deployment in particular. In 1983, at the same time as Jane Hickman, Rebecca Johnson, and Hilary were working to promote peace, feminism, and access to justice, a female officer who had been newly recruited to Special Branch was being primed to spy on the women's peace movement. In her witness statement to this inquiry, HN33 recalls how she was singled out by a superintendent and was expressly told that the Prime Minister wanted to know what the Greenham women were doing and asked whether she would be prepared to help the police to find out. She agreed and was placed with the SDS. According to her statement, HN33's training was almost non-existent. She was given no advice about sexual relationships with those under surveillance, about not encouraging criminal activities or legal professional privilege. She was left to her own judgment as to how far she could become involved in the personal lives of those she was monitoring. HN33's tasking to infiltrate the Greenham women was so generalised that she had free rein to select the group and individuals that she chose to intimately survey. We note, sir, the concessions made on behalf of the Commissioner in its opening statement in relation to a general failure by managers to lead the SDS properly and effectively in the Tranche 2 period, and invite you to consider, sir, how this impacted on the oversight of and justification for HN33's deployment in particular. HN33 infiltrated LWP, Lambeth Women for Peace, in June 1983 using the false identity of Lee Bonser. She lied and told the group that she'd left an abusive partner and so had recently moved to the area on her own. Although those in the group had reservations about her at the outset, they felt sorry for her because she seemed an isolated figure who lacked a social network. As LWP was a group open to any woman to attend, she was ultimately welcomed in and befriended. HN33 became a regular attendee at meetings and helped to plan and organise events. She took part in LWP activities, went on demonstrations, fronted stalls, and represented LWP at other forums. She visited people's homes, joined in with social events, and bought rounds in the pub after meetings. She even shared a tent with an LWP member on one of their visits to Greenham Common. HN33 had infiltrated the group to such an extent that when she informed LWP that she was moving to Australia as cover for her redeployment in 1986, the group threw a goodbye party for her and gave her a piece of silver jewellery as a farewell gift. What they now know is that HN33 abused the friendship and kindness of activists to collect huge amounts of private and personal information. That included detailed reporting on political discussions and campaign plans, home addresses, phone numbers, educational employment details, activist relationships and sexualities, bank details, and other financial information. By the end of HN33's deployment, the majority of regular LWP attendees had been given special branch registry file numbers, seemingly for no other reason than involvement with the group. Information collected about the group's activities was not only retained, but included in reports by senior officers and passed on to clients, including the security service and, on at least one occasion, the American government. I note here, sir, that a particularly concerning aspect of HN33's deployment was her willingness to report on discussions subject to legal professional privilege, and the court case mounted by Green and Women Against Cruise Missiles against President Reagan. Her reports included details of Jane Hickman's legal role and her place of work as a solicitor. HN33 was not provided with any advice or guidance by SDS managers in relation to legal professional privilege, and no one raised any issues with her in respect of this reporting. As counsel to the inquiry notes at paragraph 61 of his opening statement, no officer in this tranche had been trained to recognise legally privileged material. In our submission, this was a gross failure. HN33's statement indicates of LWP that their activities were always peaceful. She says that she had some sympathy for their cause. Yet senior officers in the SDS chose to continue her deployment with the group for a period of almost 4 years. Her colleagues, HN65 and HN88, also on occasion, through their infiltration of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND, produced detailed and largely inaccurate reporting about the Green and Women, and in particular, Rebecca Johnson. The question that has preoccupied the women that we represent from the outset is why? Why were they spied upon? They had done nothing wrong, and certainly nothing to justify such intrusive surveillance. Why were the Green and Women seen as appropriate targets for surveillance in the first place? And most fundamentally, how could this abhorrent practice have existed unchallenged in a supposedly democratic country? I turn then to the lack of justification in relation to HN33's deployment and the targeting of the women's peace movement more broadly. At the outset, our clients wish to adopt the cogent points on the law relating to intrusive undercover policing in paragraphs 5 to 25 and 35 to 37 of the opening statement of Diane Langford to Tranche 1, Phase 3 of this inquiry. Sir, in Tranche 1, your interim report identified the striking feature of the reporting of the SDS was that it contained extensive details about individuals, their political views, personality, working life, relationships with others, and family and private life. Further, the report found that such intrusion into the private and political lives of activists required cogent justification before it should have been contemplated as a police tactic. Such justification was wholly lacking in respect of our clients. It should have been plain to HN33 and her handlers early on that her deployment in LWP was wholly unnecessary and that her continued presence within the group served no useful purpose at all. LWP's numbers rarely, if ever, went beyond 12. Meetings tended to average around 8 women. In their words, they were a fairly reasonable, mild-mannered lot, certainly not trying to pick fights. Events were orderly in the extreme. Before HN33 joined the group, and following its formation, the women had organised a few events, including a peace camp on Clapham Common in May 1983 to celebrate Women's International Day for Disarmament. I would be grateful if the document at UCPI 0000036934 can now be shown. And then it's the final page of that document. I'm very grateful. Displayed on screen is a promotional poster for the camp, which gives a flavour of the sorts of events that LWP organised. I'd be grateful if photo 4 can now be shown. This is a photograph taken of the day. Hilary recalls that councillors and local MPs, including Harriet Harman, visited and supported the camp. Events included stalls, child-friendly activities, speeches and music. Only a month after this event, HN33 joined the group. During her infiltration, she reported on LWP events such as silent vigils, a demonstration to protest against the harassment of lesbians at Islington Green, and the Peace Bus lent by the Greater London Council to LWP. I'd be grateful if photograph 5 can now be shown. Thank you. Through the course of HN33's deployment, LWP activities had widened to include, for example, support for the anti-apartheid movement, the campaign to save the South London Women's Hospital, and fundraising and support for a school for women in Ethiopia. Be grateful if that photograph can now be taken down. Thank you. LWP was not a suitable target for surveillance on the basis of public order issues, subversion, serious crime, or threats to national security. And it's clear on HN33's intelligence reports that no such justification materialised during her deployment. Sir, on that point, we invite you to reject the suggestion by the Metropolitan Police Service at paragraph 68 of their opening statement that the deployment of officers such as HN33 could be justified because such threats needed to be ruled out. In assessing this argument, sir, you will no doubt consider whether a near 4-year deployment in a small and entirely peaceful women's group could ever be proportionate to rule out the theoretical risks imagined by the NPS. In addition, the evidence disclosed so far suggests that at no point was there an assessment or consideration of the justification for or proportionality of the infiltration of LWP or of the Greenham women more generally. HN33 certainly maintains that she was not privy to any such discussions. Had these issues been considered, the only possible conclusion could have been that targeting such a group was not justified or proportionate. I turn then to important considerations in relation to the justification of the targeting of the women's peace movement more generally, in particular in relation to the activities at Greenham Common. Firstly, sir, the Greenham women's aims and methods did not pose a risk to national security or national safety. To suggest that the Greenham women posed such a risk would be to completely misunderstand their movement. They were strongly committed to making the world a better, safer, and more peaceful place, and protecting people in this country from the harms posed by nuclear weapons. Further, they were not subversive. This is accepted by HN33 in her statement. She did not, in fact, witness any subversive activity during her entire SDS deployment. Greenham women aimed to effect change through the democratic political process. In terms of any purported contribution to public order, for reasons that we set out in more detail in our written opening statement, intelligence obtained by HN33 relating to planned protests or activities at Greenham Common was generally either redundant or could have easily been obtained by less intrusive means. LWP were rarely privy to sensitive discussions relating to plans at Greenham by virtue of their location in London and infrequent visits to the camp. Further, the disclosed intelligence reports are littered with inaccuracies, rendering them an unreliable source for operational policing decisions. HN33 herself accepts that some reports are inaccurate or exaggerated. And finally, on the relationship between SDS intelligence and the policing of demonstrations, sir, it's important to note that, in any event, the base at Greenham was secured by multiple forces, including Thames Valley, Ministry of Defence Police, and sometimes the NPS, along with American and British soldiers. It is difficult to imagine that those at the base were in any way reliant on intelligence from an undercover officer in South London. The policing of protests at Greenham was heavy-handed, brutal, and sometimes violent, particularly from 1982 onwards. Rebecca Johnson recalls in her evidence being arrested and dragged away from the site for a charge that was later dropped when the case went to court. As somebody who has more experience than any other witness to this inquiry of the circumstances at Greenham Common, she would strongly reject any suggestion that demonstrations were successfully or more proportionately policed because of SDS intelligence. The video clip shown by counsel to the inquiry on Monday provides an example of police use of force and violence in response to a peaceful protest, an issue that Dr. Johnson addresses more fully in her witness statement. It is revealing, sir, that HN33 herself was unable to explain any impact whatsoever that her reporting had on the policing of events at Greenham or elsewhere. On the issue of justification, finally, we invite you to reject the argument advanced on behalf of the Metropolitan Police Service that concern expressed by the governments of the United States and United Kingdom that demonstrators might be shot by American airmen should they occupy the base could somehow justify SDS surveillance of these groups. Such claims must be carefully and forensically scrutinised. How do the Metropolitan Police Service say SDS intelligence helped to avoid such a risk? Is there any evidence to support that position? What were the alternatives? No doubt there was already cooperation between the two states in relation to security arrangements at the base, along with a heavy policing and military presence. It does not follow that undercover surveillance was required in order to further diplomatic dialogue on the issue. On the evidence to date, the alleged concerns could not justify the intrusive and long-term steps taken when a simple diplomatic request to invite American state forces to exercise restraint should have sufficed. We submit that the only safe conclusion on the issue of justification on the evidence as it stands so far, sir, is that the intelligence gathered in relation to the Greenham women by HN33 and other officers made no contribution to proper policing purposes, and certainly non-sufficient to justify the means employed. I finally turn to a core question that our clients have and that they respectfully suggest the inquiry should endeavour to answer. If there was no real policing need for surveillance of the Greenham women, what was the true motivation for this intrusion into our clients' lives? HN33 was asked to join the SDS because Prime Minister Thatcher wanted to know what the Greenham women were doing. This suggests not only that surveillance of Greenham was driven by the Prime Minister herself, but that she expected to be appraised of the intelligence that came back. The MPS and other state core participants must explain why this completely inappropriate political interference in operational policing decisions took place. Consideration of the political context in which such a request was made is essential to fully understand its significance. Alongside other groups seeking to effect social and political change in the T2 period, the Greenham women attracted particular hostility from Prime Minister Thatcher and ministers of her government, who clearly felt threatened by popular support for the campaign and public opposition to the government's position on cruise missiles. Jane Hickman explains in her evidence that as the political tone became more aggressive in 1983, the year that the missiles arrived at Greenham, media coverage of the protests at Greenham shifted. Barely a week passed without one paper or another denouncing the camp. This was also the year that HN33's deployment began. Government documents disclosed to Rebecca Johnson under the Public Records Act, referenced fully in our opening statement, show that in December 1982, Miss Thatcher received advice from Conservative peer Lord Belloff to abandon the kid gloves approach and seek publicly to discredit the Greenham Common women and their supporters. He suggested that intelligence services should investigate the movement's finances, as well as the background and characters of the women involved. In his words, this was in order that the aura of martyrdom could be stripped from them. In January 1983, Michael Heseltine was appointed Secretary of State for Defence. Within weeks, he established Defence Secretariat 19, DS19, a secret unit set up within the MOD to combat CND and calls for nuclear disarmament. As you heard from Mr. Scobie of King's Counsel on behalf of CND yesterday, when Kathy Massiter, a former MI5 employee and whistleblower, spoke out publicly about the unit, she described how intelligence relating to the peace movement was circulated through Whitehall by MI5 and passed to DS19. She also revealed that DS19 was leaking evidence to the press to discredit peace campaigns. Document evidence make clear that the security service had a particular interest in the Greenhall women and made a number of requests for information about the group, as well as its relationships with other campaigns, roles within the camp, influence held by certain women, and control of Greenhall finances. Our clients know that this is exactly the sort of internal gossip used to discredit the Greenhall women in the highly critical articles published by newspapers in this period. Rebecca Johnson and Jane Hickman give numerous examples in their evidence of the type of coverage which aligns closely with STS intelligence reports as disclosed by the inquiry. It is notable that the rationale for the STS's work for the security service has been defined to the inquiry so far as to assist the service in its counter-subversion work. Yet, as we know, HN33 was aware throughout her deployment with the STS that the Greenhall women were not at all subversive. Security service interest in Greenhall must, therefore, have been motivated by something else. Considering what is publicly known already about DS19, it is evident that ministers at the time had no qualms about the use of intelligence services for political ends. Indeed, the Metropolitan Police Service has already admitted that Special Branch engaged in unacceptable political policing in relation to some STS deployments in Tranche 2. Our clients consider that it was due to political motivations at the highest level of government that the women's peace movement was targeted, rather than any genuine security considerations. This is a key issue that they wish to investigate in Tranche 2, sir. So, with these concerns and observations in mind, we set out in detail at paragraph 71 of our written opening statement the questions that our clients have and that they hope that this inquiry will answer. It is of fundamental importance to the clients that we represent that the inquiry helps them to find out the truth of why they were targeted. That is why they've taken the time at considerable personal and emotional cost to engage and cooperate with the investigations so far. However, they are dismayed that HN33, the police witness who is of central importance to this aspect of the inquiry's work and to the questions that they have, has declined to give evidence before this inquiry. In our submission, the likely reason that she will not attend is because she herself knows that her actions and those of the STS were unacceptable and cannot be justified to this inquiry or to the public. We respectfully invite you, sir, to take into account HN33's failure to attend and to place no or little weight on her evidence where it conflicts with that of Jane Hickman, Hilary Moore and Rebecca Johnson, all of whom are willing to give evidence before you. Turning then to other procedural matters. Jane Hickman has, following disclosure of evidence of the undercover surveillance to which she was subject, painstakingly compiled evidence that is relevant to that period at the request of the inquiry. That further evidence includes numerous diary entries made during the period of HN33's deployment. I do not intend to rehearse every aspect of the procedural history relating to this issue, as it has been set out in correspondence to the inquiry's legal team. But, in short, due to timings issues, Ms. Hickman has been told that it is unlikely that the inquiry will be able to publish this material in the hearing bundle. We would respectfully invite the inquiry to revisit this decision and to make all efforts to make these materials available in time for Ms. Hickman and Ms. Moore to give evidence, in light of their clear and obvious relevance to the inquiry's investigations and terms of reference. Further, our clients wish to place on record that they have found the difficult timelines and inquiry processes very stressful, exacerbated by unmanageable pressures to complete statements requested under Rule 9 of the inquiry rules, while still reviewing documents and revisiting memories from decades ago. A particular issue for our clients has been the narrow approach taken to disclosure prior to deadlines for witness statements requested under Rule 9. For example, Rebecca Johnson was provided with only a handful of intelligence reports prior to the preparation of her statement, only to later discover that the inquiry has within its possession 161 reports associated with HN33, nearly all of which are highly relevant to SDS surveillance of the Greenhall women. Disclosure issues such as these inevitably cause the greatest disadvantage to non-state core participants who are less able to review the material and respond fully. Our clients endorsed the concerns raised by other non-state core participants, and in particular by the coordinating group, in relation to the procedural difficulties so far and the steps required in future tranches. I pause here to address you, sir, on the distinct and important concerns that Rebecca Johnson wishes to place on the record in relation to her evidence to this inquiry. The following comments come directly from her. Dr. Johnson has contributed a significant witness statement relating to the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, Cruise Watch, Molesworth and other peace campaigns during the height of her engagement during 1982 to 88, which also included substantial involvement in the CND as a council member and then vice chair. As part of the inquiry process, as a core participant, Dr. Johnson received 7 disclosures from April 1984 to 1986, which provoked questions and mainly exposed a large intelligence vacuum. The disclosures did not shed light on why she and other peace activists were targeted, but led to Rule 9 questions that required Rebecca to delve into memories and documents from that period that distressed her in many ways. Dr. Johnson wishes to endorse what has been said on behalf of the Category H participants by Ms. Kilroy of King's Counsel in her opening statement to this inquiry. In responding to the inquiry's questions and hoping to gain more understanding about the purpose and extent of SDS operations, Dr. Johnson decided to share with the inquiry traumatic experiences as well as distressing personal information. She hoped that her statement and questions would contribute to understanding the larger picture of undercover policing affecting the peace movement, in which she played a very prominent role over the Tranche 2 period, whilst various undercover officers were also active, including but not limited to HN33, HN65 and HN88. A decision has been made, however, not to call Dr. Johnson to give oral evidence to the inquiry, a decision which made her feel marginalised and caused her to consider ending her participation in the process. Ultimately, sir, she has decided to continue her engagement on account of her desire to discover the truth, and she urges the inquiry to go as far as it can to fill the knowledge vacuum and to provide answers to the serious questions that core participants, like Dr. Johnson, are taking the trouble to ask. In conclusion then, sir, the evidence in Tranche 2 shows, as in Tranche 1, that the SDS was a secretive, cynical, political policing unit with no regard for the civil, political and democratic rights of those it spied upon. The conclusion of your interim report, sir, and the starting point for the inquiry's Tranche 2 investigations is that the ends used by the SDS did not justify the means, and had the methods used by the SDS been publicly known at the time, the unit would have been brought to a rapid end. The decision to monitor the women we represent, who were so wholeheartedly devoted to peace and non-violence, represents a further example of policing that had exceeded its powers and gone far beyond anything reasonable in a democratic country. But it goes further than that. It shows very clearly how the impulse to spy on such groups sprang from the perception that they were opposed to the politics of the government of the day. It is made explicit in the disclosures to the inquiry that the Greenham women came under intrusive surveillance because the Prime Minister wished to know more about them. At no stage did any politician or police officer articulate the nature of any threat posed by their activities, or even set any criteria by which they might have been judged. On this basis, anyone could be spied upon. Our clients have, in each of their respective fields, devoted their working lives and much of their free time to public service. They are dismayed by the waste of resources and the thoughtlessness of the exercise carried out against them at considerable public expense. They hope, sir, that your inquiry leads to lasting changes which put in place the mechanisms of scrutiny and accountability that a genuine democracy requires. Unless I can assist you any further, sir, that concludes my opening.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for sticking to the constrained time that we all have. May I just say one thing about Dr. Johnson? It is no disrespect to her that she was not invited to give oral evidence. It is because what she says about undercover policing is relatively limited, and what she says about other things is outside the scope of my inquiry. And furthermore, there is no reason to challenge what she says about those issues. In those circumstances, it would be a waste of her time and of my time and of public money to invite her to speak orally about them at the inquiry. It's no disrespect to her, and I'm grateful to her for continuing to participate.
Thank you for that indication, sir. You have my submissions on the relevance of her evidence.
Yes. Thank you. We will now hear, for the first of two times, from Mr. Greenhall. Mr. Greenhall.
Sir, I present this opening statement on behalf of Mr. David Morris. Mr. David Morris has written his own opening statement, which is to be published on the inquiry website. In what follows, I will present a slightly shortened version of that statement. Whilst I will not read it in the first person, other than that, I will be using Mr. Morris's own words. This opening statement is divided into the following sections. First, background to this statement. Second, the unjustified and unjustifiable deployments. Third, unacceptable tactics employed. And finally, some conclusions. Background to the statement. This is Mr. Morris's fourth opening statement after writing and presenting one himself at the start of each of the previous phases of the hearings. Mr. Morris is in part a litigant in person. This is partly to save on some of the inquiry's legal costs and partly to ensure an authentic voice during this inquiry of one of the victims of the undercover policing units. He speaks as a lifelong community activist and organizer, doing his best to stand up for the rights of people in defense of the environment and the future of our society and planet. Mr. Morris was targeted by undercover police units from the mid-1970s for at least 30 years. David Morris wrote his own witness statement for Tranche 2 earlier this month, last month. As a result of the substantial delays in the disclosure process, Mr. Morris expects to submit a second witness statement at the start of Phase 2, covering matters which he has been unable to cover in his first statement. The matters in this opening statement largely reflect upon the significance of the matters dealt with in Mr. Morris's witness statement. The details are therefore not repeated in this overview. The questions Mr. Morris was asked to answer in his witness statement seem to focus heavily on the efforts by the police to try to retrospectively justify their unjustifiable deployments and tactics. Hence, this opening statement focuses on the deployments and tactics themselves. Second section, unjustified and unjustifiable deployments. This opening statement will try to summarize how the reporting on Mr. Morris and the groups with which he was associated was unjustified and unjustifiable. All the groups targeted were small campaigning groups pursuing issues of widespread public concern and trying to create a better society for everyone. Those involved in the campaigns were concerned members of the public doing their best to question and improve things. The inquiry's interim report in June 2023 concluded about the SDS deployments that the question is whether or not the ends justified the means. I have come to the first firm conclusion that for a unit of a police force, it did not, and that had the use of these means been publicly known at the time, the SDS would have been brought to a rapid end. The interim report was timely, coming at a time when the Met had been found by other inquiries and official reports to be institutionally racist, sexist, and corrupt, and remained under special measures since July of 2022. The Metropolitan Police themselves have finally been forced to admit in their closing statement for Tranche 1 that, by modern standards, the SDS's deployments in this period are unjustifiable because of the way they were structured, not least because there was a failure to consider intrusion, necessity, and proportionality. The key questions that need to be asked and answered are: A, did these unjustifiable deployments continue? The answer is yes, and to a much greater extent. And B, did the unacceptable tactics employed continue? The answer is yes, they did, and got even more unacceptable. Looking back at Dave Morris's activities as an activist and anarchist throughout the Tranche 1 period of the 1970s, it is significant that the undercover officer Graham Coates, who for years targeted him personally and the groups he was involved in during that time, concluded, "I do not think that either the International Socialists or the anarchist movement was subversive in terms of their actions. I do not believe any information I provided was particularly significant. I do not think it would have made any difference to public order if I had not worked for the SDS." This statement will now address some of the groups that Mr. Morris was involved in relevant to Tranche 2 that were specifically targeted by the SDS. The London Workers Group, or LWG. The LWG existed from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, and Dave Morris was significantly active in the group for most of that period. LWG's aims were to promote solidarity and awareness amongst fellow workers around London, to encourage people to organise themselves in workplaces, to collectively challenge the dictatorial power of those who exploit workers, and to support workers taking action to stand up for their needs and rights. LWG was an open collective involving anything between 3 and 30 people at weekly coordination meetings and fortnightly or monthly public meetings, addressing a wide range of subjects. As well as its meetings, the LWG produced leaflets and a bulletin and attended various protests, picket lines, and demonstrations. Dave Morris supports the witness statement of the call participant referred to as MSW inasmuch as it covers matters within his knowledge. Undercover officer Tony Williams infiltrated this entirely open and transparent group, abusing the trust of those attending and taking part, who, in good faith, were doing their best to advance the LWG's very positive and much needed aims. Mr. Williams took on significant roles, including publicity manager, group representative at an international conference, treasurer, and secretary, a position he abused to be able to steal the private contact details of the group's supporters. Tony Williams admits in his witness statement that he did not witness any public disorder by the group. Instead, the SDS interest in this group appears to be driven by the LWG's support for workers in trade disputes. His reports were sent to MI5. This raises real concerns over blacklisting. UCO Tony Williams attended a birthday party held in a private house by a member of LWG. He admits that he, quote, would not have been a credible undercover officer unless he had lived the normal life of a member of the group and attended birthday parties and the like. This sums up a routinely unacceptable aspect of SDS-type activity, that it cannot avoid gross invasions of people's privacy. Tony Williams makes a further significant admission in his statement, that is that after 4 years' involvement in the anarchist movement, he did not witness nor become involved in violence whilst deployed undercover, save that the police in Scotland in Torness were somewhat heavy-handed in dealing with what was essentially non-aggressive trespass. Therefore, the only example of violence that he can think of in his 4-year deployment is by the uniformed police. A security service note dated the 30th of July 1982 records that SDS managers viewed Tony Williams's deployment as not a particularly productive source, end quote. Mr. Morris asked the inquiry to question why no employers have ever been infiltrated for their systematic daily exploitation of workers and robbery of their labour, their daily illegalities regarding workplace health and safety, trade union rights, rights to breaks and overtime pay, use of blacklisting, and violent threats to sack workers and leave them and their families penniless if they don't obey orders without question. Persons Unknown Defence Campaign. This was a traditional defence campaign in 1978 to 80 for people arrested on serious conspiracy charges and facing trial. Again, Mr. Morris was an activist in the group for most of that period. The group's aims were to provide welfare, legal and publicity support to those arrested, publicise and criticise the repressive policing and laws involved, liaise with journalists and spread news about the case to counter media hysteria, attend hearings and take notes, liaise with solicitors and so on. As far as Dave Morris can recall, the coordination meetings were open and run collectively. The activities including producing leaflets, organising public meetings, pickets and so on. Eventually, the charges against the Persons Unknown defendants were reduced and they were found not guilty. Despite all that, Tony Williams abused the trust and privacy of those involved by attending meetings and reporting on them, including on the legal advice and strategy of the defence. No doubt this benefited the police, who were facing criticisms about the case. Mr. Morris asks that the inquiry ask if, and if not, why not, any police force units have ever been infiltrated by undercover officers trying to identify such units' use and abuse of violence against members of the public, discriminatory stop and search, corruption, misogyny, racism, disregard for the justice system, and or interference with rights to demonstrate and thereby creation of disorder. London Greenpeace. London Greenpeace was the first Greenpeace group in Europe, set up in the early 1970s. In 1977, it was invited into, but declined, a merger with a new Greenpeace UK, which became famous for its direct action tactics at sea. London Greenpeace continued to be a loose, open collective which met publicly on a weekly basis. Its aims were to encourage people everywhere to question and take action individually and collectively to respect and protect the environment, respect all animals, oppose all wars, and generally encourage people to take control of their own lives instead of governments and corporations controlling the world's resources and decision-making. London Greenpeace did all the usual things any campaign group would do: hold discussions, produce written material, brief the media, organise public events, protests, and so on. Mr. Morris first associated with the group during its anti-nuclear power campaigning at the end of the 1970s, getting actively involved in the group from around 1982 until today. Regarding evidence from others involved in London Greenpeace, Mr. Morris supports the statement of Albert Beale inasmuch as it covers matters within his knowledge. Mr. Morris has not been permitted access to the witness statements of others from London Greenpeace. From the mid-1980s, for at least 5 years, the trust and privacy of those involved in the group or attending its open meetings, and indeed the integrity of the whole group, was seriously abused by long-term infiltration by SDS undercover police officers. For a number of years, the undercover officer, Bob Lambert, was a prominent and influential activist in London Greenpeace, which he publicly summed up in 2011 as a peaceful campaigning group. He engineered fraudulent and therefore abusive sexual relationships with a number of women, including fathering a child, who he later abandoned, strongly promoted animal rights direct action, acted as agent provocateur, including being accused of responsibility for the burning down of a Debenhams store. Dave Morris also believes that Bob Lambert contaminated a court case by participating in a false identity and helped write the anti-McDonald's fact sheet, which became the subject of the McLibel case. Bob Lambert was later promoted to become head of the SDS. Meanwhile, he handed over his deployment in London Greenpeace to the undercover officer John Dines. This was also a long-term and influential deployment in which Dines helped produce leaflets, organised events and protests, and became group treasurer. He cynically engineered a long and fraudulent, therefore abusive, sexual relationship with group participant Helen Steele, in which they lived together as a couple for 2 years. After Helen Steele and Dave Morris were sued for libel by the McDonald's Corporation, it was discovered that Special Branch, and they later found out John Dines too, were collaborating with McDonald's, who had also infiltrated the group. Dines were getting details of their confidential legal advice and strategy following their meetings with their lawyer, Keir Starmer, who helped them pro bono for 10 years during the case, the longest and one of the most controversial in English legal history. Mr. Morris asked the inquiry to ask why the SDS did not infiltrate the government for their support for wars and for their promotion of and threats to use weapons of mass destruction, and why the SDS did not infiltrate corporations, for example, for the destruction of the environment, the food industry's daily mass cruelty to billions of animals, and the fossil fuels industry responsibility for causing climate change, which is on course to wipe out most of humanity. London Greenpeace eventually had to put its work on hold as activists had to devote most of their time to the McLibel case, and so the McLibel support campaign was set up. Mr. Morris will give further detail about this in the autumn. Mr. Morris asks the inquiry to ask why the SDS did not infiltrate McDonald's for their responsibility for systemic daily industrial scale breaches of the law regarding workers' rights and animal welfare. Stop the City protests. The early 1980s saw the growth of a huge anti-militarist movement opposed to the US government's threat to site a new generation of nuclear missiles throughout the UK and Europe. There were mass protests of tens of thousands of people outside the gates of military bases. Dave Morris and other activists in London Greenpeace launched a call for protests in the city against the financial institutions which finance and profit from the arms trade and war. Thousands took part in 4 such events in 1983 to 4. Its remit expanding to encompass protests against capitalism as a whole. The events were organised and coordinated by open, publicised meetings. It was decided that there would be no leaders or even spokespeople. The idea was to encourage a wide range of peaceful, decentralised and self-organised activities all day throughout the city to engage with those who work there, slow down financial activity and reclaim the city for people, not profit. An SDS undercover officer had infiltrated the London region of CND and reported on their deliberations on whether and how to support the protests. There are many other undercover officer reports, many containing inaccuracies and mischaracterizations about the plans and events, and about Dave Morris's role as a leader and the aftermath. Mr. Morris asks the inquiry to ask why the SDS did not infiltrate any city financial institutions or hedge funds for their investments in and support for a systemic daily global exploitation of people, global poverty and hunger and destruction of the environment. Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign, TSDC. Mr. Morris was one of the initiators and coordinators of the TSDC, set up in 1990 for the 491 people arrested following the 250,000 strong anti-poll tax demonstration in March of that year. The demonstration was on the day before the government's controversial new poll tax was due to be imposed and followed weeks of residents' protests outside town halls throughout the country. The demonstration had been attacked and broken up by the police, and an, inverted commas, riot ensued. The TSDC was a traditional defence campaign in its aims and ways of working. It was coordinated through open, collectively run meetings and provided welfare and legal support to those arrested. It called for the charges to be dropped, including on the grounds of the well-established legal right of self-defence against police aggression and the traditional political right of self-defence against an unfair law or government policy. It organised pickets of legal hearings in prisons and produced newsletters and general publicity. It won the support of the whole anti-poll tax movement and ensured the movement stayed united and strong in the face of continuous media and government attacks. By the end of the year, over 14 million people were refusing to pay the hated tax. It was unenforceable and was scrapped. Mr. Morris will say more about the TSDC and how its targeting by the SDS was unacceptable in the autumn. Some other groups and campaigns relevant to Tranche 2. Mr. Morris was also involved in some other groups within the Tranche 2 period, which were also unnecessarily and unacceptably targeted by SDS officers. For example, the anti-nuclear power movement, in particular the peaceful 1979 to 80 protests at Torness in Scotland, which at least 4 SDS officers targeted, and the Broadwater Farm Defence Campaign in 1985 to 1989. Mr. Morris lived close by at the time, and this was a traditional defence campaign which was critical of the police. Mr. Morris supports the statement of Stafford Scott. Next section, unacceptable tactics employed. Influencing groups and activities. In most of the examples above, the police spies took on positions of responsibility and/or were influential in other ways. This was and is totally unacceptable. Engineering fraudulent personal and sexual relationships. Both Bob Lambert and John Dines manipulated women into long-term intimate relationships to further a secret police agenda. This was and is totally unacceptable. Hoovering up personal and private information. The SDS officers stole groups' contact lists and invaded people's lives and homes, hoovering up masses of personal and private information to pass on to MI5. This was and is totally unacceptable. Exhibiting unprofessional and biased attitudes, language, and behavior. The SDS officers dehumanized and demonized members of the public trying to make society better, treating them with utter contempt. They did this with the unprofessional and biased language used in their reports, their mischaracterization of people and their motives, their abuse of people's trust, their own spying activities. All of this was and is totally unacceptable. Disregard for legalities and legal process. The SDS was enabled to act with secrecy and impunity beyond the law. Officers were empowered by their managers to enter people's homes without a warrant, systematically breach people's rights to personal privacy, collaborate with blacklisting of trade unionists and others, engineer abusive sexual relationships without the victim's informed consent, act as agent provocateurs, breach legal privilege, report on confidential legal advice, and ascertain defense campaign strategies, undermine and show contempt to the justice system, for example, a failure to declare to courts their real name and true role. They were able to collaborate with corporations against campaigners. All of the above was and is totally unacceptable. The unacceptable nature of these practices was underlined by Mr. Morris and Helen Steele's successful 2005 libel verdict against the UK government at the European Court of Human Rights, in which the court ruled. The government had pointed out that the applicants were not journalists and should not therefore attract the high level of protection afforded to the press under Article 10. The court considers, however, that in a democratic society, even small and informal campaign groups, such as London Greenpeace, must be able to carry on their activities effectively, and that there exists a strong public interest in enabling such groups and individuals outside the mainstream to contribute to the public debate by disseminating information and ideas on matters of general public interest, such as health and the environment. Although this was part of their successful verdict against the oppressive nature of the UK libel laws, the conclusion quoted above could just as easily be transposed to the illegal and unacceptable actions of the SDS and the need to protect campaign groups from being infiltrated and undermined. The final section is on bias. The spies' reports and the police generally used and continue to use biased and politically charged language to attack and stereotype campaigners and protesters, such as violence rather than self-defense or resistance, disorder rather than reclaiming the streets or collective empowerment, subversion rather than challenging oppression or seeking a better society, extremism rather than commitment to real change. Indeed, such loaded words as violent, disordered, subversive, and extreme can reasonably and accurately be used to describe the current way society is run by a ruthless and inhuman system intent on maintaining the profits and power of an elite as a cost to the public or planet, a system that movements for change were and still are rightly questioning, opposing, and challenging. In conclusion, the use of and tactics employed by undercover officers to target the groups Mr. Morris was involved in was an outrage and totally unjustifiable, as already effectively conceded by the Met Police in February 23 and in the inquiry's interim report. People have a fundamental right to organise themselves to protest and seek positive change. People have a right, maybe even a duty, to challenge unacceptable government and capitalist policies and practices harming society, and to encourage everyone to seek to create a better society. There is a long and noble tradition, going back centuries, of refusing to accept unfair or repressive laws and measures, such as secret political policing, which only serve to protect oppression and injustice. Protests and movements for change also enable people to empower themselves and each other and should be encouraged everywhere. By spreading collective self-organization, mutual aid, and community solidarity, it can be demonstrated that there are alternative and better ways of living and running our society. This is real democracy in action. So that is the opening statement on behalf of Mr. Morris in his own words.
Thank you. I know that you have a second opening statement to make on behalf of other participants, and you are going to do that at 12.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Sir.
Then we'll rise until 12. Thank you. We will now resume. Mr. Greenhall.
Thank you, sir. This opening statement is made on behalf of Diane Abbott MP and Dame Joan Ruddock, both of whom are core participants in Category D. In 1987, Diane Abbott became the first Black woman ever to be elected to Parliament. Her parliamentary career grew out of her long-standing involvement in many racial justice campaigns. She has been a leading anti-racism campaigner for many decades. She joined the Labour Party in 1978 and was active in the Black Sections movement within the party. In 1982, she was elected to Westminster City Council, representing Harrow Road, the ward in which she had been born. In 1987, she was elected as MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington and has remained so for over 35 years. She was an early campaigner for justice for the family of Stephen Lawrence and was briefly president of the Anti-Racist Alliance in 1994, which campaigned on the issue. She has held frontbench positions for the Labour Party. Documents disclosed in this phase of the inquiry reveal that undercover officers reported on numerous events at which she spoke during the Tranche 2 period. The Right Honourable Dame Joan Ruddock, PC, was an anti-apartheid campaigner and former chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. MI5 has revealed that she was subject to unlawful surveillance in 1983. She was later MP for Deptford from 1987 to 2015. She forged close links throughout the country with major green organisations. She too held frontbench positions for the Labour Party. Documents disclosed in this phase of the inquiry show that CND was the subject of extensive surveillance by SDS officers. Diane Abbott MP and Dame Joan Ruddock, who I'll refer to as the core participants, or these core participants, share a number of concerns which they wish this inquiry to address in its investigation of the SDS. Each also raises particular concerns of their own. The concerns are set out in detail in the written version of this opening statement, and this oral version will summarise some of those concerns. They include the unjustified targeting of political campaigns, targeting of MPs and adequacy of disclosure, concerns raised by Diane Abbott MP over racial discrimination in the activities of the SDS, concerns raised by Dame Joan Ruddock over the use of information gathered by the SDS, and procedural issues relating to the inquiry, including failures in disclosure and delay. First section, the unjustified targeting of political campaigns. Reporting in relation to both these core participants concerned groups which were open, transparent political campaigns, and which neither sought involvement in public disorder nor to overthrow the state. The SDS spying on these groups was completely unjustifiable. In relation to Diane Abbott, she features in reports as a speaker at events held by anti-racism campaigns. Many of the intelligence reports into groups campaigning for racial justice relate to entirely open, transparent political and campaigning events. For example, SDS officers reported on a film shown by the Anti-Racist Alliance at the Rio Cinema in Hackney. This would have been a publicly advertised event open to all members of the public, which did not require any sort of undercover infiltration or operation to gain information. Yet this event appears to have been attended by an undercover officer and the resulting report copied to the security services. In relation to Joan Ruddock, the reporting primarily in this tranche relates to her role as chair of CND. CND was the largest anti-nuclear weapons campaign in the United Kingdom during the Tranche 2 period. It organised many large-scale demonstrations. These were well-organised, open demonstrations. SDS reporting in 1982 contained details of an upcoming demonstration and records, quote, "It is obvious that the organisers of the demonstration wish the event to be peaceful and intend to give police every cooperation," end quote. Nonetheless, CND was repeatedly referred to in SDS annual reports and explicitly targeted, often at the request of the security services. To the extent that CND was viewed as subversive or had the potential to be influenced by subversive groups, the assessment by the SDS, as recorded in a meeting with the security services in 1984, is telling. The SDS said that their assessment was that there was no effective ring of subversives unduly influencing the democratic structure of CND, end quote. CND was an organisation with a very strong democratic structure that was not involved in subversion in any way, and this fact was known to the SDS. In relation to both core participants, the groups spied on were open campaigning organisations, often directly engaged with the democratic process. There was no legitimate reason why such groups should have been targeted for surveillance, either directly or indirectly. The complete lack of lawful authority and regulation for the SDS activities identified in the interim report following Tranche 1 enabled this unjustifiable police surveillance to go unchallenged. Section 2. Targeting of MPs and the adequacy of disclosure to the inquiry in this area. Announced in Parliament by the former Prime Minister Harold Wilson in November 1966 and in place ever since, the Wilson Doctrine prohibits the targeted surveillance of MPs by state agencies. The Wilson Doctrine forms part of a broader principle that state agencies must not be used to undermine the democratic process. These core participants are concerned about police surveillance of MPs and inappropriate collection of personal information. The former undercover officer, Peter Francis, has revealed that both Diane Abbott MP and Dame Joan Ruddock were spied on by undercover officers whilst they were MPs. Peter Francis indicated that he personally collected information on Diane Abbott when he was deployed undercover infiltrating anti-racist groups. Peter Francis also revealed that undercover surveillance of Joan Ruddock, which began during her time as chair of CND, had continued in the 1990s whilst she was an MP. Peter Francis stated that the special branch files were typically, quote, very extensive and often contained personal and private information. It's notable that only Labour MPs appear to have been targeted. Following the establishment of this inquiry in March 2015, in an urgent question in Parliament, Peter Hain, then an MP, requested that the remit of the inquiry include the surveillance of the MPs named by Peter Francis, which included both these core participants. Both these core participants spoke in the subsequent debate, directly asking questions about the extent to which they were subject to surveillance. Diane Abbott emphasised the point that she was not engaged in seeking to undermine democracy. On the contrary, many of the campaigns she was involved in served to reinforce democracy by engaging with people who didn't have a voice, notably the Stephen Lawrence campaign. She asked who authorised the surveillance and on what grounds. Dame Joan Ruddock, giving her farewell speech as an MP, also spoke. She similarly asked who authorised the surveillance on her, stated that the issue affects all MPs and called on the government to ensure that there was a proper investigation. The response from the Minister for Police and Criminal Justice and Victims, Mike Penning, was that he would, quote, do everything I can to make sure that the documents are released. He went on to state that, quote, it sounds ludicrous that this should have taken place in the mother of all democracies, and we have to find out exactly what went on. This inquiry is charged with carrying out that investigation. We can see signs of SDS interest in MPs in the 1980s in some of the documents. For example, a security service note in 1982 records that an undercover officer's position in the right to work movement gives him regular access to Ernie Roberts MP and meetings at the House of Commons. However, there appears to be a disconnect between the volume of material gathered by undercover police on MPs, as indicated by Peter Francis, and the material actually disclosed by the undercover policing inquiry to date. There also appears to be a disconnect between Peter Francis' revelations and the statement of undercover officer HN65 John Kerry, who claims that elected politicians were exempt from the usual research and referencing processes. The core participants ask that these discrepancies are investigated during this tranche and in future tranches to ensure that the inquiry uncovers the full truth of what took place. Section 3, concerns raised by Diane Abbott MP. Diane Abbott MP is particularly concerned that the issue of racism is not lost in the many areas investigated by this inquiry. Annual reports for the SDS indicate that concerns over campaigns on racial issues were a key aspect of targeting. The Anti-Nazi League, a variety of local anti-racist and anti-fascist groups, and predominantly Black family justice campaigns regularly feature in the groups targeted across the Tranche 2 era. What is also clear from the annual reports is that local Black campaigns remained largely free from influence from other organisations. As the 1982 annual report states, SDS information has indicated that no links exist between the highly politicised Brixton anarchists and the local young Black community. all attempts to build bridges between the political and purely criminal elements have proved a total failure, end quote. The characterization of the local black community as, quote, purely criminal reveals a racist perception that underpinned the approach taken to the black community and black activists. It is important to acknowledge that racism now. It also ignores the well-established black-led political campaigns that were active during this period. Moreover, even though the SDS recognized that there were no links between black-led groups and white anarchist agitators, the SDS continued to view black-led campaigns with inherent suspicion. Many of the reports produced during this period explicitly acknowledged that the groups spied on were not involved in disorder. However, the purported justification for infiltration appears to be a concern that these groups might be taken over by other organizations. This assumption that black-led organizations could not preserve their own independence similarly displays racist attitudes that were present at the time. For example, in August 1983, the security services visited the SDS to discuss sources in the Hackney area. The security services expressed an interest in 50 Rectory Road, N16, the headquarters of the Hackney Community Relations Executive. And the report quotes, which has recently let rooms to the subversively controlled campaign against the police bill. But the report stated, quote, other coloured groups also meet at the same address. It was agreed that HN88, Timothy Spence, was to be deployed to the Stoke Newington area, quote, initially without a precise target, and to, quote, familiarise himself with Stoke Newington and Hackney and whatever subversive undercurrent he could detect. This explicitly undirected deployment is symptomatic of a racist assumption that areas of London where black-led campaigns for racial justice were growing should be viewed with suspicion. HN88 details in his statement that he viewed his deployment as primarily geographically based and did not have any direction towards particular groups. Given his wide geographically based deployment, HN88 reported on a number of different organisations. Perhaps inevitably, given he was deployed to Hackney, this included many small organisations campaigning on issues of racial justice. Details of the particular groups that he infiltrated and reported on are set out in the written version of this opening statement. HN88 states repeatedly in his witness statement that he did not view any of these groups as subversive. Quote, their aims were to improve particular aspects of society from their point of view, rather than overthrow the current workings of the state. Moreover, in relation to public order concerns, he states that he did not witness riots or activists throwing things at the police. The high point appears to have been marches which obstructed the highway and pickets outside police stations. HN88 explicitly connects his fears over public disorder to the racial composition of the area, stating, quote, there was a potential challenge to public order at rallies due to anti-police feeling from, in particular, black youths in the area, end quote. However, this fear is undermined by his own experience, where he states that in relation to violence to either people or property, the most he witnessed was, quote, shouting and insulting behaviour. There appears to be little to justify this open-ended, geographically based deployment, other than an unwarranted fear over politically engaged campaigns in an area with a large ethnic minority population. The involvement of the security services in a deployment that covered groups which were recognised by HN88 as not subversive on any sensible meaning of the term is also questionable. Concerns over racial bias in the SDS operations do not end in the 1980s. Another example is a report dated February 1995 on the first meeting of the National Assembly Against Racism, the NAAR. This was a predominantly black-led anti-racist group, largely seen as the successor to the Anti-Racist Alliance. It was not involved in public disorder or subversion of any kind. Indeed, the report itself states that the Assembly is, quote, a vehicle for lawful and democratic opposition to racism. HN78 Trevor Morris, had the cover name Anthony Bobby Lewis, claimed in his witness statement that it is, quote, the risk of other groups hijacking or seeking to hijack the NAAR that justified his reporting. The suggestion that a black-led organisation campaigning on issues of racial equality was inherently susceptible to being taken over by extreme groups is itself reflective of racist assumptions. It perceived the black organisers of these groups as no more than vessels for the intentions of white political activists. This perception was both contaminated by racism and revealed to be false. Those organising the NAAR were well capable of maintaining their independence from outside influence. As the report had to conclude, quote, attempts by the more extreme political groups to hijack the assembly will probably be unsuccessful due to the diverse and independent nature of its component groups. The undercover officer, HN78, was one of the few black police officers working in the SDS. He states in his witness statement for the inquiry that he experienced various forms of racism whilst in the Metropolitan Police and Special Branch, and even brought a discrimination claim against the police. Significantly, HN78 includes evidence of incidents of racism from senior officers within the SDS. He specifically identifies HN86 as a racist officer and states that this was confirmed to him by the former undercover officer, Peter Francis. The presence of racist officers within the SDS is of particular concern given the role the SDS had taken on in investigating groups that were themselves campaigning against racism within the police force. HN88, for example, who infiltrated the Roach Family Support Committee, acknowledged that the group was not subversive and did not present any greater risk than any other single-issue campaign group. He nonetheless seeks in his witness statement to the inquiry to justify his targeting of this group on the basis that its criticism of the police and on an explicitly racialized basis of, quote, the potential challenge to public order at rallies due to anti-police feeling from, in particular, black youths in the area, end quote. Diane Abbott welcomes the belated recognition by the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police that family justice campaigns and community organisations, which the SDS reported on, were not engaged in any form of criminal or subversive activity and did not present any significant risk of disorder. The Commissioner now accepts that SDS officers should have been told by their managers not to report on those groups. The Commissioner also now recognises that it is, quote, particularly indefensible that many of the anti-racism campaigns mentioned in SDS reports were seeking justice for members of the Black and Asian communities in London and were attempting to hold the NPS itself accountable for the way in which it policed those communities. The NPS states that it now accepts the corrosive effect this type of discriminatory policing had on the public trust and apologises unreservedly for this, accepting corporate responsibility for these failings. Diane Abbott asks that this inquiry examines how such failures in proper management and oversight were allowed to occur. Whilst acknowledgement of failings and apologies are welcome, it is only by getting to the truth of what actually took place that lessons may be learned to prevent repetition of similar issues in the future. To this end, it is important not to lose sight of the suspicion with which Black-led political groups were viewed in the 1980s and early 90s. Such organisations were often seen as ipso facto subversive, and such attitudes are reflected in the activities and reporting of the SDS. All of this ignores the simple fact that anti-racist organisations were typically well-organised, open campaigns which did not concern themselves with public disorder. Many of the smaller groups campaigning on racial issues which feature in the SDS reports are not directly represented in the inquiry. However, concerns over racism in the SDS are one of the key areas of the inquiry's terms of reference. Diane Abbott MP asks that this inquiry gives close scrutiny to the apparent racial bias in the way SDS activity was carried out. Section 4, concerns raised by Dame Joan Ruddock. Dame Joan Ruddock raises concerns about the use to which information gleaned from reporting on CND and related groups was put by state agencies. It's clear from documents disclosed to the inquiry that direct requests were made by the security services to the SDS to target CND. These requests were often coupled to political and diplomatic concerns at the time. Details of these reports have been set out in the written opening and will not be repeated here. The SDS appears to have been only too willing to carry out such surveillance of CND at the request of the security services, with little regard for the propriety of such infiltration and to their own assessment that CND was not susceptible to subversive influence. Moreover, the SDS does not appear to have given much regard to the fact acknowledged by HN65 that, quite a lot of the information could have been obtained without resorting to undercover methods. Given the amount of resources deployed by the SDS and the Security Service into obtaining information about CND and those connected to it, the question must be asked as to what use was the information put. Given the clear political and diplomatic angles that arise, an obvious concern is whether the information was used for political means or shared with foreign intelligence agencies. The corporate statement on behalf of the security services does not dispute that information gleaned from SDS sources may have been shared with foreign liaison partners. Witness Y claims it would be a disproportionate exercise to ascertain definitively if it was. No attempt to do so has been made, and the witness declines to give an opinion as to whether such sharing was likely. This response is unsatisfactory and does not appear to accord with an attempt to get to the truth of how and why SDS officers were deployed into an organisation like CND, and the inquiry is asked to examine this aspect in more detail. Regarding the domestic use of information obtained from SDS sources, there are concerns that such information was passed to government ministers who clearly had a political interest in seeking to discredit CND. There are also concerns that information from SDS files was used for the purposes of vetting individuals for political and other appointments. That past involvement in one of the largest anti-nuclear movements could inhibit the future career of those concerned is reminiscent of the authoritarian regimes which the SDS and security services claimed to be fighting against. The designated lawyer officer core participant group in its opening statement claims that had the SDS not existed, the security services would have sought to obtain the information provided by the SDS from other sources, and suggest that this is a relevant factor in considering whether criticism of the SDS is justified or worthwhile. Joan Ruddock takes issue with this suggestion. It is no answer to criticism of the SDS to suggest that information would have been obtained in any event. The SDS was responsible for its own operations and was required to ensure that it was not misused by other parts of the state. The inquiry is asked to investigate these issues fully and fearlessly and to expose the extent to which the SDS was used by the security services to spy on the peaceful democratic campaigning organisation that everyone, even the SDS, recognised CND to be. The final section addresses procedural issues. Like many others, these core participants raised concerns over the disclosure process and delays in this phase of the inquiry. It's notable that the impact of these delays has almost exclusively been to the detriment of non-state core participants. The state core participants have generally had sight of many documents for several years, whilst non-state core participants and their representatives have been required to sift through thousands of pages of disclosure in a matter of weeks. The inquiry is asked to ensure that issues arising from delays and particular delays in disclosure to the non-state core participants do not reduce the accountability of those responsible for the SDS. These core participants also wish to highlight the significant lack of cooperation with the inquiry of many former undercover officers. In particular, HN33 and HN88 have declined to give oral evidence to the inquiry. HN33 infiltrated Greenhall Common and therefore touches on concerns raised by Joan Ruddock. Concerns over HN88's deployment into Hackney have already been highlighted above. Sir, it is more than disappointing that those who were supposed to be public servants have chosen not to cooperate in your inquiry's search for the truth. Not only did the actions of these officers in the 1980s undermine the democratic process by infiltrating and reporting on entirely legitimate political campaigns, the actions of these former officers continue this trend by undermining this inquiry's investigation and attempt to learn lessons. In conclusion, the inquiry is asked to investigate the matters set out in this opening statement. The concerns raised by these core participants reflect wider concerns raised by other non-state core participants. This inquiry presents a unique opportunity to examine key aspects of the interrelationship between policing and the democratic process in this country. The inquiry is asked to seize this chance to make recommendations for lasting change, which will prevent any repetition of the abhorrent activities conducted by the SDS and ensure future protection for civil liberties of citizens in the United Kingdom. And thank you, sir. That is the opening statement on behalf of Diane Abbott and James Joan Ruddock.
Thank you very much indeed. We will now hear from Mr. Jacobs on behalf of two other core participants. Mr. Jacobs.
Good afternoon, sir. These are the opening remarks on behalf of Sharon Grant, OBE, and then on behalf of Stafford Scott. I'm instructed by Simon Crichton and Molly Cox of Bat Murphy Solicitors. So we have raised with the inquiry in correspondence our client's desire to have had instructed leading counsel Matthew Ryder, King's Counsel, deliver this opening. We acknowledge the inquiry's reasoning, but do emphasise the importance of the inquiry not marginalising the experiences of Bernie Grant or Stafford Scott in a way that will be felt to mirror the treatment of them by the Metropolitan Police. For these clients, the desire to have a black representative on the legal team is entirely justified and important. First, the opening remarks in respect of Sharon Grant. I would ask that an image of Bernie Grant is placed on the screen. Bernie Grant made an important and pioneering. Shall we wait for the image? So shall I continue whilst we're waiting for that to be
If you're content
put
to
up?
do so, arrangements have been made to put the photograph on the screen, and I didn't. If you'd anticipated, there it is now.
Thank you.
We now have it.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful. Bernie Grant made an important and pioneering contribution to British society and politics. Having arrived in the United Kingdom as a teenager, he attended university and went on to become involved in the trade union movement. Having been elected as a councillor in Haringey, he went on to lead the council, the first black person in Europe to do so. In 1987, he was elected to Parliament and he retained his seat until his death in 2000. On his death, the then Prime Minister described him as inspirational, and his portrait hangs in the Houses of Parliament. The revelation that he was reported on by undercover police officers is an affront to democracy. Sharon Grant's feeling and concerns about this behaviour are set out in her witness statement. Her statement was based upon a limited set of reports that names Bernie Grant directly, as well as snippets from a few of the witness statements prepared by undercover officers. Now that there has been further disclosure, including the evidence of reporting on other members of Parliament, the picture that emerges is even more concerning. There are 28 reports disclosed that directly mention Bernie Grant. One of the officers, HN25, who filed 9 of those reports, has estimated that approximately 3/4 of his reports are missing. There is clearly far more information that has not been retained or disclosed by the Metropolitan Police. The position taken by the undercover officers about their role in reporting on members of Parliament is to minimise it. HN78 states that he was simply providing the intelligence, it was for others to decide on relevance. He says he was never told not to include information on MPs. HN25 claims that it was all justifiable and proportionate and helpful for appreciating alliances between groups. HN88 gives the explanation that he reported it because it was relevant to the community's views of the police in the context of campaigning against police-related legislation. While these explanations are unsatisfactory, it is even more disturbing to read that HN85, who was first an undercover officer but later went on to command Special Branch and have responsibility, therefore, for the SDS, makes the frankly unbelievable claim that, to his knowledge, none of his contemporary UCOs while deployed reported on the activities of any elected politicians. There are a number of reasons why the purported explanation of incidental reporting is not tenable. First, in Bernie Grant's case, he had a registry file number, meaning that Special Branch had opened a file on him and that he was already the subject of monitoring and possibly surveillance. There are numerous references to reports being passed to the security services, both in respect of Bernie Grant and other MPs. Second, the reports filed upon Bernie Grant go beyond reporting his mere presence at events but purport to analyse the content of his speeches and his sincerity. In one report, he is described as cynical and embarking on a tour of conspiracy theories. Another report describes him as being inflammatory. No undercover officer has claimed responsibility for these reports. HN 78 denies being the author despite the very clear links to him. Either HN 78's denial is false or another undercover officer was reporting on Bernie Grant. In her witness statement, Sharon Grant rather charitably describes these comments on Bernie Grant as impertinent, but they go beyond that. They are expressions of political opinion which underline that the reporting was wholly divorced from any proper policing purpose. They must reflect an understanding on the part of the undercover officers that opinions expressed by persons such as Bernie Grant were of interest, and likely that opinions of which it was thought that criticism could be made were particularly of interest and may be weaponized in some way. It is also telling that these comments arise in the context of views being expressed about the Metropolitan Police and the function of policing by a Black Member of Parliament. That reflects an institutional culture in which criticism of the Metropolitan Police is not only of interest to the undercover officers, but is the subject of criticism in their reporting. Despite the repeated statements that reports on MPs were no more than a record of their presence, the evidence suggests that the report served a different purpose. HN 25 has made reference to reporting on alliances. What are we to understand about the need to know about MPs' purported alliances? When HN 78 was debriefed in 1995, he reported that the SWP would have more leverage under a prospective Labour government due to their contacts with Bernie Grant and other MPs. The reporting on MPs clearly served a purpose that went beyond recording their presence at events. Sharon Grant has asked the inquiry to investigate what was done with the information reported in respect of Bernie Grant. Was any of this information given to the media? Was it passed to the government of the day? What effect did it have on Bernie Grant's reputation in Parliament and specifically within the party's leadership? Did it have any impact on the many serious issues that Bernie Grant sought to raise, whether on behalf of his individual constituents or those of wider significance? Sharon Grant has highlighted her long-standing concerns that the police passed misinformation to the media to seek to discredit her husband and the wider Black community, the most glaring example being the misreporting of his actions and statements in relation to the events at Broadwater Farm. The language of the disclosed reports and the details of who they were shared with has only heightened her concerns. She has also noted that many of the reports refer to Bernie Grant's participation at events where his constituents had experienced injustice at the hands of the Metropolitan Police. These included the killing of Joy Gardner by police officers and the wrongful conviction of Winston Silcott. Disturbingly, HN 78 even reports that he spoke at one of the demonstrations concerning the death of Joy Gardner, although no report has been filed or disclosed. Given that this campaign was run from Bernie Grant's office, Sharon Grant would like to know whether undercover officers infiltrated the premises of an elected politician. She expects the inquiry to fulfil its remit by exploring all of these issues and to reach an understanding of the extent to which this undercover reporting not only went beyond any proper policing purpose, but served the political motivations of the Metropolitan Police and/or the security services, and served to interfere with and to subvert proper democratic processes. I'm grateful for the image being shown, and perhaps it can be taken down now as I move on to the opening remarks on behalf of Stafford Scott. Thank you. Stafford Scott is a core participant in his own right and on behalf of the Broadwater Farm Defence Committee, That committee was conceived by the community with the support of the local authority and local MP to protect the rights of the community in the aftermath of the Broadwater Farm disturbance and the killing of PC Blakelock in October 1985. The need for the committee transpired to be prescient given the injustices that followed, including wrongful prosecutions and convictions and the wider treatment of the local community by the police. Stafford Scott was himself also the victim of police misconduct. In his witness statement, he described his arrest and detention in 1985. He was arrested at gunpoint, held incommunicado for 36 hours, and subjected to racist taunts. The Metropolitan Police subsequently paid him substantial damages for assault, false imprisonment, trespass, and malicious prosecution. In 2011, and at the age of 54, he was again subjected to a wrongful arrest, handcuffed and held at a police station after he had been subjected to racist harassment in the street. In a subsequent letter of apology by the Deputy Assistant Commissioner Richard Martin, Stafford Scott's work with the Metropolitan Police and other organisations to better improve community relations was acknowledged. Stafford Scott has always worked to bring about improvement and positive change in the experiences of his community and in the policing of that community. He has no political affiliations. He has campaigned for justice for those who have been the victims of police misconduct and malpractice. Many of the issues and themes that Stafford Scott has worked on and the concerns he has raised have subsequently been acknowledged in official reports and inquiries. Most recently, Stafford's work in exposing the racist and divisive gangs matrix operated by the Metropolitan Police resulted in it being withdrawn. Stafford Scott continues with his work as a community activist, race equality specialist, and through anti-racist advocacy work. He is a visiting professor at Goldsmiths University. In recent years, he has curated War in a Babylon, a groundbreaking exhibition on community struggles for truth and rights, and the Open Wounds exhibition, exploring the connections between health, racism, and inequalities, and how that has affected generations of Black people through their own eyes. His work has never been remotely connected with subversion or public disorder. Notwithstanding, both he and the Broadwater Farm Defence Committee had registry file numbers opened on them by Special Branch and are the subject of intelligence reporting, including by undercover officers. Unsurprisingly, Stafford Scott believes that he should be seen as a constructive voice working for the good of the community rather than a target for intelligence gathering. His interest in this inquiry shares a commonality with justice campaigns who are represented in this inquiry. In the last tranche of hearings, there was evidence as to undercover officer gathered intelligence in respect of Celia Stubbs and the campaign in respect of the death of her partner, Blair Peach. As we submitted on behalf of Celia Stubbs, the gathering of intelligence was not just without justification. It pursued the objective of the MPS protecting itself and evading accountability, something it did successfully. It was a particularly duplicitous and abhorrent use of covert police powers. We act for others in justice campaigns and police accountability groups who will be directly participating in future hearings, but who are also affected by the evidence heard in this next tranche of hearings. As counsel to the inquiry observed in opening, there is a significant quantity of reporting on a large number of racial justice campaigns in the Tranche 2 Phase 1 hearing bundle. Our clients, in relation to whom there is relevant evidence in these forthcoming hearings, include Lee Lawrence, whose mother, Cherry Gross, was shot by a police officer in their family home on 28th of September 1985, causing her paralysis and subsequently her death in 2011. Myrna Simpson, whose daughter, Joy Gardner, died after being restrained by police officers at her home in Crouch End on the 28th of July 1993. Bernard Renwick, whose brother, Roger Sylvester, died in January 1999 after being restrained whilst detained under the Mental Health Act. Winston Silcott, who was wrongly convicted of the murder of PC Blakelock, despite not having been near the scene and his convictions subsequently being quashed. And Dr. Graham Smith and Mark Metcalf, who were founding members of the Hackney Community Defence Association, the HCDA, and the Colin Roche Centre. Of course, there are others in this inquiry who also share a similar interest. They share in common the characteristic of pursuing police accountability and doing so by lawful means. They should never have been targeted by undercover officers and should never have been the subject of undercover reporting. They also share in common the characteristic of being on the fault line in community tensions between the Metropolitan Police and the black community. In this tranche, the Metropolitan Police accepts that the individuals that the SDS reported on in these groups were not engaged in any criminal or subversive activity. The Metropolitan Police now admits that SDS officers should have been told by their managers not to report on those groups. It also describes it as particularly indefensible that intelligence was gathered in respect of anti-racism campaigns that were seeking justice for members of the Black and Asian communities in London and were attempting to hold the NPS itself accountable for the way in which it policed those communities. The Metropolitan Police further states that it, quote, accepts the corrosive effect this type of discriminatory policing has on public trust and apologises unreservedly for this, unquote. The fact that the SDS reported on these groups is described as a critical failure on the part of managers and senior managers within Special Branch. Those acknowledgements and the apology are, of course, entirely appropriate on the evidence and are welcome. 3 observations are made, however. First, it is difficult to see why a similar acknowledgement has not already been made in respect of the reporting on Celia Stubbs and the Blair Peach campaign. The inquiry's interim report left the reporting on justice campaigns to be considered at a later stage, and her compelling evidence and submissions to the inquiry in that sense remain for the present unanswered. Second, the Metropolitan Police maintains that the intelligence gathering on such campaigns was incidental to reporting on certain political organisations. That is disputed. The submissions made on Celia Stubbs' behalf in the last tranche make clear the avid interest that Special Branch had in police accountability groups and justice campaigns. Third, and relatedly, the acknowledgements by the Metropolitan Police do not address the uses to which such intelligence was put. The concern, of course, is that the intelligence was deployed by the Metropolitan Police to resist criticism and accountability. The largest single source of reporting on the BFDC, the Broadwater Farm Defence Committee, and Stafford Scott is contained in HN25's intelligence report. He submitted over 30 reports referring to the BFDC and Stafford Scott. He has noted, though, that approximately 3/4 of his reporting is missing. It is also known that HN5 lived on Broadwater Farm in his cover identity, having deceived Helen Steele into a relationship. Stafford Scott has seen just one paragraph from HN5's witness statement, which he factually disputes. H88 is clearly a significant witness, having been tasked to community and ethnic minority groups in the area, but will not be giving evidence. There was never any suggestion of public order issues arising at BFDC events. One example is the report of HN25 of a demonstration at Wormwood Scrubs Prison on the day before a Court of Appeal hearing for the Tottenham 3. This was an entirely peaceful demonstration by a small number of people and was addressed by Tony Benn MP. The agenda of the police can be seen by the attempt to report a reggae song about the struggle people face to overcome injustice as somehow being an indication of violent behaviour or guilt. It is indicative of racist attitudes within the police and the portrayal of black people as confrontational or violent, even in the most peaceful of circumstances. One report by HN25 refers to one of the acquitted Guildford Four attending a human rights conference with a family member of the Tottenham 3 and discusses the tactics, quote unquote, of these justice campaigns. HN 25 also states that reporting on campaigns against wrongful convictions was justified, even where the convictions had been overturned, to understand the potential for cooperation between groups or to see where funding came from. This reveals an interest in obtaining information about the workings of the campaigns themselves, and not a concern about public disorder or subversion. The suggestion that reporting on justice campaigns and police accountability groups was incidental is repeated in the witness evidence of HN 5, HN 78 and HN 90. This explanation lacks any credibility. The reports disclosed by undercover officers reveal an intense interest in these campaigns. These are campaigns that have sought to hold the police to account for their actions, whether it be the wrongful convictions of the Tottenham Three or the killings of Cherry Grosh, Joy Gardner, Roger Sylvester, Stephen Lawrence and others. The Broadwater Farm Defence Committee was not alone in being the subject of attention, with all of the individual campaigns as well as organisations such as Newham Monitoring Project and Hackney Community Defence Association also being the subject of undercover reporting. HN 78 even goes as far to admit that he was allowed to look at files held by HCDA dealing with police corruption. We also note the SDS branch note of 31st of July 1991, which specifically examines the deployment of DS Morris, a black undercover officer, and refers to him being employed in monitoring the activities of local groups such as the HCDA and Hackney Solidarity Group. That is document reference MPS 0726965. Stafford Scott remains of the view that the police had difficulty in infiltrating community organisations and used political campaigns to gain access to them. To an extent, this is acknowledged in the statement of HN 78, albeit that he justifies the reporting as keeping tabs on the attempts by those organisations to make inroads into the community for their own purposes. It is also supported by two reports concerning HN 78's initial tasking. These documents refer to the advantages of HN 78 being black and the SDS's previous experience of covering ethnic communities as being unproductive. The sheer volume and range of reports on justice campaigns and the reference to such campaigns in the SDS annual reports, the copying of such reports to the Security Service, and the existence of registry file numbers for individuals and organisations all point towards this intelligence gathering being purposeful rather than incidental. HN 78 alone accepts that he reported on campaigns concerning the Tottenham Three, the Winston Silcott Defence Campaign, Roland Adams' family, Brian Douglas, and Joy Gardner. He also specifically accepts that his move to the Tottenham SWP may have been a directed move from his managers and was connected to issues arising from the death of Joy Gardner. The theme then, as the evidence showed in Tranche 1, is unjustified reporting on justice campaigns and groups concerned with police accountability. Of course, Stafford Scott would never have been concerned with such campaigning work were it not for the injustices and discriminatory policing which appears now to be accepted by the Metropolitan Police. So those are our opening remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. We will now adjourn until 2 o'clock when we will hear the opening submission on behalf of the non-police, non-state core participants coordinating group, Ms. Hedden. Thank you.